Dan Lawrence. I'm a human performance coach and head of performance at Matchroom Boxing. Over the past 18 years, I've had the pleasure of coaching over 30 champion athletes, from NFL Super Bowl winners, undisputed boxing champions, and numerous Premier League footballers. In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into the force velocity curve and why this is important. So not all exercises are created equal. And remember, an exercise is just a means to drive a physiological adaptation. What do we mean by that? Well, if you've got an explosive exercise like a medicine ball punch release, where you don't have a deceleration component, you're accelerating through the whole motion with a 3 or 4 kilo medicine ball, that's a very different exercise to doing a very heavy 3 repetition back squat with 0/1 RIR, where you're working to near failure. They're very different. And how they rank on the force velocity curve, again, represents a very different adaptation that you're trying to elicit. If you're looking to build a complete athlete, we want to expose the athlete to various different points on the force velocity curve. Equally, when you're doing a diagnosis of an athlete and identifying what sport they're doing, so for example, a 100-meter sprinter would want to produce quite high amounts of force, but they'd also want to do it in a very short time horizon. Then you have someone like a powerlifter, and a powerlifter would rank somewhere up here. They've been producing very high amounts of force, but done so under no real time constraints. It really is just getting from point A to point B. So now you can start thinking about the sport you do, and then you can rank the exercise on the force velocity curve to see where it ranks and what adaptation you're trying to elicit from that specific exercise. So on the left side here, the y-axis, we have force measured in newtons, and on the x-axis down the bottom, we have velocity. At the top, we have max strength, the maximum amount of force you can exert against an object, or sometimes isometrics would be against an immovable object with an overcoming isometric. But this would look something like your heavy back squat. 90 to 100% of 1 rep max, so really working towards near failure now. And the exercises you choose, as I say, would be something like a back squat. It could be a trap bar deadlift or another deadlift variation, a bilateral motion where instability is certainly not a factor, because you're trying to produce the highest amount of force to elicit a max strength-based adaptation. So now working down the curve, we now move into strength speed. So notice the names here. We've got strength speed, peak power, speed strength, and max velocity. Strength first here means strength is going to be greater than speed. So therefore, we're going to be working 80 to 90% of 1 rep max. It's still pretty heavy load, but you're going to be, the movement velocity is going to be quicker than max strength, the power lifter, for example. So what type of exercise would we do here? You could do an Olympic lift derivative. And again, we're working relatively high load, but the rep range will still be relatively low. So you might be looking at 3 to 5 repetitions here. We're looking to as well move the curve over to the right. We know there's an inverse relationship between force and velocity. The heavier the load, the velocity will then be lower. So this is where we're now looking to move and shift the curve to the right as we're building these qualities to make a more complete athlete. We then have peak power, and there's a really broad range here. We're looking at 30% of 1 RM, 1 rep max, all the way up to 80% of 1 rep max. And this again might be an Olympic lifting derivative. It could be a trap bar variation of one of those Olympic lifting derivatives, like a trap bar triple. But again, working between the ranges of 30 to 80% to really elicit more of a peak power based adaptation. We're now moving down into speed strength. So not to be confused with strength speed, because that was at 80 to 90% of 1 RM. We're now looking lower. We're looking speed first, 30 to 60% of 1 rep max. And we'd use something like a trap bar jump with this motion. A lot of my athletes do it, trap bar jump for the taller individuals off the blocks. And I'm going to come to some other data with velocity-based training shortly, but we'd be looking anywhere between 30 to 60% of 1 rep max. We then finally, the complete opposite of max strength is max velocity, where we're now looking at less than 30% of 1 rep max. This could be a sprinter, max effort sprinting, or it could be one of the medicine ball exercises that we mentioned earlier. Lots of kind of explosive motions now that don't produce high amounts of force, but are done at high velocities. So that there is the force velocity curve. As I say, the goal is to shift and move the curve to the right. which is why we have to understand what adaptation we're trying to elicit from an exercise and from a program. And remember, an exercise is just a means to elicit a specific adaptation. So don't just throw random exercises together. Don't just, if you're looking to train really high velocity, have short recovery periods and turn it into conditioning, because you're not going to elicit the specific adaptation of that set exercise or program for that specific day. We're going to go a step deeper now, though. And lots of what I've used over the past 6 or so years, originally from the great research of Dan Baker. I had the pleasure of spending a day or 2 days with him in London a good few years ago. More recently, my good friend Chris Toombs as well has really driven velocity-based training. And I also spent the day with Professor Brian Mann, who really popularized velocity-based training with different velocity training zones as well. So 1 rep max and the percentage of 1 rep max is good, but it is quite a dated way of looking at things. So these days we identify that not all days are created equal. We can use Aura or Whoop, and you can see that one day your recovery might be at 60, the next day your recovery might be at 98 out of 100. So you can see that based on daily stress, based on relationship stress, based on training stress, fatigue, poor nutrition, poor sleep, not every day is the same. Well, because of that, that's where percentage of 1RM on Monday, if you're working at 90% on Monday, you're trying to do the same thing on Thursday, but again, your recovery may be very poor. 90% is not a blanket term. This is where velocity-based training can actually come in and provide a greater level of objectivity of how you present on that specific day. And this is where, to go a step further with our athletes, we can auto-regulate based on what the data is showing on that day. And what that basically means, we can either push or pull back based on how the athlete presents themselves. So going back to Professor Brian Mann's data with velocity-based training, we have different zones. So whereas it was max strength here with the 1 rep max viewpoint, we're now looking at absolute strength. And absolute strength is anywhere below 0.5 ms. And I should also state, this could be read through, I personally use Output. Our friends over in Dublin, Martin and Dara, they've developed a really cool device which can measure the velocity of the bar of the specific exercise. So let's use something like a trap bar deadlift, for example, because that's something we use very frequently. We place the unit on the bar, they stay tight, they rip the load up with maximal intent, really key to drive the adaptation. And we're looking to get anywhere lower than 0.5 ms. Certain exercises do have an MVT, a minimum velocity threshold. So, for example, like a trap bar deadlift, we won't go any lower than 0.28. Otherwise, it becomes a very slow grinding rep. And for context, the lower the number, the slower the rep. So 0.5 ms. If, for example, we're trying to drive absolute strength and the athlete's moved it at 0.7 ms, that then tells us they've got the potential, providing technical component that's adhered to, so they're executing with proper technique. They've got the potential to then increase the load because they're moving it too quickly for the adaptation we're looking to elicit. So it gives that real in-play feedback. We then have accelerated strength, anywhere between 0.5 to 0.75 ms, before moving into strength speed, which is anywhere between 0.75 to 1. So again, you can see that if the athlete is, for example, we're looking to drive a more straight speed-based adaptation, and they moved it at 0.5, well, we know that weight's probably a little bit too heavy to drive that adaptation. And this is where you can really get the buy-in from your athletes that you're saying, we need max intent, because look, you're too slow here. Whereas, 3 days ago, you were doing the same numbers, the same load, and you were moving it much quicker. So it really drives intent. If you're working with multiple athletes as well, you can bring a bit of competition in. Again, always use technique as the number one driver. As soon as technique deteriorates, stop. Because we do see this with coaches with all of this new tech, they're focusing on the numbers and they're not looking at the athlete. Technique has to be the number one driver, and the data then merges with that. We then move into speed strength. So this would be anywhere between 30 and 60% 1RM on the force velocity curve. And this would be something like a trap bar jump. Staying tight, jump, absorb, and then we want speed between 1 and 1.3 ms. So for context, I have some athletes with a lower training age doing 50 kilo on a trap bar jump. Some might be 60, some may even be 65. But again, if they're moving that load too quickly, we can increase the load, and vice versa. If they're moving the load out of those zones a little bit too slow, so maybe at 0.7, 0.8, then we'll take a little bit of load off. And we'll have a conversation with the client, an athlete, to see, are they fatigued that day? We'll maybe then check their sleep scores, their subjective markers as well, and then see that actually they're probably only operating at about 70% on that day. So let's lower the load, or maybe just prioritize recovery and scrap the session completely. So that's where the data can really allow us to make better informed decisions. And then we have starting strength, which is anywhere quicker than 1.3 ms. So that's a broad overview. We know that force times velocity equals power, which is something that I use quite a lot with my boxers. You want to become a more powerful athlete? Oh, brilliant. Well, this is the basic 101 guide of the force velocity curve. So knowing that we can raise up the limit of force production, increase the horsepower in the car's engine is what I normally say to them. So a really good way to get buy-in from them is, you want to become more powerful? Let me break this down within 30 seconds. I try and keep it super simple for them. And we say, right, you're in a 1.6 car. Well, if we follow a strength block where we're looking to raise up a limit of force production, we can turn your 1.6 into a 1.8 or maybe even a 2-litre car. We've got the potential to become a more powerful athlete. Emphasis on the word potential doesn't necessarily guarantee power, but it increases the horsepower, the size of the engine. And then what we've got to do is, when we surf the curve and work more speed, strength, peak power, max V, we can then improve the velocity component. You merge the higher horsepower in the engine with more reactive, elastic, explosive exercises. Then you build a more powerful athlete. And that, for me, with my boxers especially, really gets the buy-in, that they have this basic understanding of the force velocity curve, so that then buy into the methods. And, if they haven't done much strength work in the past or didn't really like doing it, they now understand that actually it's an integral part of the overall performance picture to become a more powerful athlete. I hope you found today's video useful. This was understanding the force velocity curve. Like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you on the next video.